Good afternoon. Welcome to Columbia Ethics Grand Rounds. I am Sandra Soo-Jin Lee, Professor of Medical Humanities and Ethics and Ethics Division Chief at Columbia University, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to our November Ethics Grand Rounds on viral justice, pandemics, policing, and public bioethics. With the help of our Ethics Grand Rounds Planning Committee that include faculty from both uptown and downtown campuses at Columbia and New York Presbyterian, the Ethics Grand Rounds is organized by the Division of Ethics, which was founded in 2018 in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics, chaired by Bernard Schoenberg Professor of Social Medicine Rita Sharon in Columbia's Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. The mission of the Division of Ethics is to integrate humanistic perspectives and ethical reasoning toward alleviating human suffering and promoting justice and equity in scientific practice and healthcare. Our faculty, staff, and students aim to cultivate a multidisciplinary community focused on ethics and to conduct innovative, high-impact bioethics research at the intersection of biotechnologies, health equity, and social justice. We launched Ethics Grand Rounds last year with Dr. Alondra Nelson, Deputy Assistant to President Biden and Deputy Director for Science and Society at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. She spoke on innovation for equity, fostering a more democratic and just scientific enterprise last fall. The focus of our Ethics Grand Rounds this year is on incarceration, policing, and health equity. According to the Vera Institute of Justice, the U.S. incarceration rate has drastically increased over the last 50 years, growing by over 400%, resulting in the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Those who are incarcerated are disproportionately people of color, immigrants, and people experiencing poverty. Our series this year will explore the impact of incarceration policing on community, family, and individual health. It will integrate multidisciplinary perspectives and will focus on the socio-political, historical, and clinical dimensions of incarceration and health justice. It will include speakers in research, teaching, and advocacy roles, and those with lived experience at the intersection of the justice system and healthcare. In convening all of us to engage these questions, we hope that together we will reflect on and take seriously the meaning of justice and to consider how we, as scholars, clinicians, scientists, educators, students, and more, will respond in our own work. In so doing, we interrogate incarceration and policing as an American public health crisis and ask how structures of inequality are created and consider the ways in which practices and policies reproduce inequities that cause human suffering. We have an opportunity to ask how each of us will take up this challenge today, and we hope the series will catalyze action that we will directly address in incarceration, policing, and its health effects, both within and outside academia. With this goal in mind, we have chosen a thought leader on change to launch this conversation today. But before I turn to our speaker, I do have some housekeeping information. We ask that all attendees please abide by the code of conduct, which can be found at the bottom of the Ethics Grand Rounds page posted in the chat. We have a live closed captioner present for this event. So if you wish to use closed captioning, please turn on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We will reserve the last half hour of this event for discussion. So please use your Q&A button, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, to write in questions for our speaker at any point during the session. You can register your enthusiasm for a question and elevate it up the list by using the upvote button in the Q&A box. The chat box is available for further engagement. We will post any relevant links to resources referenced today in the discussion there as well. And if you have any logistical questions or troubleshooting needs, please email mhe_ethics@cumc.columbia.edu at any time. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, an enthralling storyteller, brilliant scholar, and fierce advocate for all things just. Dr. Ruha Benjamin is professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, where she studies the social dimensions of science, medicine, and technology, with a focus on the relationship between innovation and inequity, knowledge and power, race and citizenship, and health and justice. As the founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, she brings together students, educators, activists, and artists to rethink and retool data for justice. Dr. Benjamin is the author of Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, editor of Captivating Technology, and she recently released her fourth book, Viral Justice: How We Grow the World We Want, born out of the twin plagues of COVID-19 and police violence. At the center of all Dr. Benjamin's work is the invitation to, quote, imagine and craft the worlds we cannot live without, just as we dismantle the ones we cannot live within, end quote. I had the pleasure of first meeting Dr. Benjamin many years ago and know the gift of her scholarship for teaching across disciplines about the importance of centering justice and the experiences of communities that all too often are erased from discourse within the academy. We are delighted that we are able to bring her work to you today in hopes it will catalyze viral justice in each of our own lives and our institutions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruha Benjamin.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely, lovely introduction. I will start sharing my screen in just a moment. We'll switch out the slides here. Awesome. Thank you. And hopefully you can see that title slide. All right. So thank you so much, Professor Soo-Jin Lee, for inviting me, to the entire planning committee for organizing this grand rounds. Shout out to our closed captioner, Corvid, and all of you for tuning in, taking time out of your busy schedules to join us in conversation. It's really an honor for me to be here. So what might a public bioethics consist of amidst the multiple crises of our current moment? Crises that in some ways converged when Officer Derek Chauvin, hands in pocket, pressed the full weight of his body on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Officer Chauvin's indifference is chilling, alongside the cries of 46-year-old Floyd pleading for mercy and crying out for his mother. One could argue that the system killed Floyd, but that would erase the role of individual actions, decisions, and volition. And so I'd like to think of this question about what a public bioethics might consist of in light of my recent book, Viral Justice. Because if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that something almost indetectable can be deadly, and that we can transmit it without even knowing. Doesn't this imply that small things, seemingly minor actions, decisions, habits, could have exponential effects in the other direction, tipping the scales towards justice, affirming life, fostering well-being, invigorating society? With this provocation in mind, I want to invite all of us to think about our roles in maintaining or overturning the oppressive status quo. How does racism and intersecting forms of oppression distort our vision, as Dr. Kamara Jones described, at the institutional level, at the interpersonal level, and even the internal level? So at all three of these scales, we can think about the role of racism in distorting how and what we see. So a few examples of this before we dive in, some more familiar than others. Of course, there are the distortions associated with policing, everyday anti-Blackness, not the stuff that hits our headlines and our hashtags, but the everyday practice of anti-Blackness, literally practice, as we see here. The faces used by North Miami PD for Target. The only reason we have this image is that the sister of one of these young men went to the shooting range after the police department had left and saw a photo of her brother with a bullet hole in his forehead sitting in the trash can. And she brought it to media attention and people rallied around because it was evident that if these are the bodies that police are practicing upon, it should be no surprise then that these are the individuals who bear the brunt of the everyday violence when these same officers hit the street. But one sort of subtext to this example that I want to flag now and come back to is that at the same time that this image circulated, a number of people, specifically clergy in the area in Miami, created a hashtag, use me instead, and they put their faces there as a way to call attention to the everyday practice of anti-Blackness and the hypocrisy and the violence associated with this institution of policing. And so they, in some ways, remind us that we don't have to just sit as bystanders, but we can begin to engage and think about what anti-racist practices look like, everyday anti-racism in our everyday lives. Moving on from policing to preschool, the full spectrum from adulthood to childhood. We see here this study out of Yale in which they put eye tracking technology on preschool teachers and had them look at children playing together and then said, look for the challenging behavior. And the vast majority of teachers' attention went to the little Black kids in the play group, even though they were behaving the same way as all the other kids. In fact, they were higher child actors instructed on how to behave. And so here we see, again, it's not simply adulthood and policing, but the profiling that starts with these little pint-sized bodies, the way that these distortions infect all of our institutions, not only the prison industrial complex. Moving on to medicine, we have social science data, from the ground to the sky, showing the biases that infect healthcare, including the fact that medical students and physicians routinely underestimate the pain of Black patients, a point to which I'll circle at the very end to show how some researchers are beginning to address this in interesting ways. Moving on to patient tech or health tech, let's say, we know that for everyday devices that we employ unthinkingly in our healthcare system have these designed biases built into them. As Amy Moran Thomas, my colleague from MIT here, writes, like the problems magnified by the coded gaze of algorithms elsewhere, even small racial disparities could amplify unequal outputs. She goes on to write, beyond the pulse ox, this also matters for other wearable chromatic devices and the algorithms they feed, pretending that they're colorblind can further amplify health disparities. Moving on from patient tech to looking at the role of medicine and sports. One of the things that's come to light in the last year or two is the practice of race norming or race correction in many different subfields, but in particular here, we're looking at cognitive function. Race norming is based on this assumption that Black people vary in predictable ways from an alleged biological cultural norm that's white. The NFL was using two different standards, one for Black players, one for whites, to assess the degree of cognitive impairment. So under this practice of race norming, retired Black players were assumed to have lower baseline levels of cognitive function than their white counterparts, which practically speaking meant that Black claimants had to demonstrate more impairment to receive the same financial awards as their white counterparts. Fortunately, as I'll show in just a moment, this practice has come to light and is beginning to be abolished. But it reminds us that what I'm drawing attention to is the everyday practices and protocols, not the huge things that often capture, the news cycle, but the things that happen behind closed doors, the algorithms, both the old school algorithms and the more emerging, the new ones that are encoded with these forms of inequity. And I want to take a moment here, just like a 2-minute historical interlude, just to remind us that these practices, these distortions, the way that we see and are seen are not natural. They're not inevitable. But to understand that, we have to understand their origins, when and how they were produced, and to reckon with the role of science and scientists in erecting this racist architecture that we all currently inhabit. And I say that because too often we can put our head down into our fields and our disciplines and think, oh, that's political stuff, that racism, that's outside of my purview, my training. And yet that ignores the role of science and medicine in helping to create the categories, the hierarchies, the epistemological infrastructure that justifies these more obvious forms of harm and violence. And so I just want to give you one taste of that before moving on. Here we see the image of French naturalist Georges Cuvier, renowned figure of the time. And Cuvier, one of the things he wrote, just to illustrate what I'm saying here, he says, the white race with oval face, straight hair and nose, to which the civilized people of Europe belong, and which appear to us most beautiful of all, is also superior to others by its genius, courage, and activity, to which, of course, he compares the Negro race, marked by black complexion, crest of woolly hair, compressed cranium, flat nose, the projection of the lower parts of the face, thick lips, evidently proximate to the monkey tribe, the hordes of which it consists have always remained in the most complete state of barbarism. So there's a lot going on here, even just with two passages from his larger body of work. I'm just going to highlight a few things before moving on. The first is to take note of this juxtaposition, this foil, blackness and whiteness. So if we imagine that we're inhabiting this racist architecture that has been erected over hundreds of years, it's to note that this polarity has been a crucial feature of this structure. So to understand the supposed superiority of whiteness, then you have to understand this foil of blackness and how it was used to make sense of this ideological distinction. The other thing to note is that Cuvier and his colleagues weren't talking in the abstract, white civilization in general, Black culture in general. No, they were mapping these distinctions onto something seemingly concrete, material. Why was that? Because every single part of the Black body has been dissected, producing evidence of inferiority. So why go through all the trouble? And so part of what we have to understand is by mapping these racist hierarchies onto biology, you begin to create this vision in which we think of these categories and these hierarchies as natural, as immutable, inherent, God-given, fixed. And the more that we come to think of these as fixed and immutable, the less likely we are to question them, much less try to change them. And so one of the first things we can all begin to do yesterday is to denaturalize this racist vision, these racist hierarchies, to understand how they continue to infect our institutions, from healthcare to education to our leisure, how we think about bodies and sports. And so again, to understand where we've come from, we can begin to see how we begin to dismantle it. The last thing I want to point out, because oftentimes when we talk about these examples of scientific racism, it's easy, people will say, oh, we can't project our values on the past. We can't impose, our sort of progressive ideals, et cetera, onto these guys. But in fact, there were people at Cuvier's own lifetime that were questioning. In fact, his own student published refutations questioning the scientific bigotry and fallacy associated with his work. Here you see an image of Frederick Tiedemann. And Tiedemann reminds us not only of the tradition of scientific anti-racism that went along and responded to and refuted the work of Cuvier and others, but reminds specifically students that they can and should question the paradigms that they're inheriting from their predecessors and their mentors, not simply to accept them unthinkingly. Just because something is published doesn't mean that it's right. And so again, we want, just like the use me instead activists in Miami, just like Tiedemann, who is questioning his mentor, this is a tradition that we want to build on, we want to water, and we want to grow. And so when we think about what we want to see differently, when we think about these examples of distorted vision, the everyday anti-Blackness, running from policing to preschool, I want to suggest that We have healthcare policies that are making us sick. We have education policies that are breeding ignorance. We have labor policies producing disposable people. We have housing policies that are manufacturing scarcity. We have tech policies encoding inequity. And we have environmental policies ensuring our collective extinction, not by accident, by design. And what we have essentially is an anti-social system, meaning that the very institutions that should be fostering social well-being, should be strengthening the social fabric, actually are wearing us down and breaking us apart. And what I think is particularly perverse, on top of the compounding harms of policing and the pandemic, is how the medical establishment too often doctors the truth. What do I mean? Quoting Floyd's initial coroner's report, the autopsy revealed no physical findings that support a diagnosis of traumatic asphyxia or strangulation. Mr. Floyd had underlying health conditions, including coronary artery disease and hypertensive heart disease. This original report was straight out of the medical racism playbook. Floyd's family was forced to hire experts to issue an independent autopsy that concluded his death was indeed a homicide. But not only that, they learned that Floyd, who had lost his job as a result of the pandemic, had also previously tested positive for COVID. Threat upon threat upon threat, converging crises. So whether people die at the hands of police or as a result of the pandemic or from deadly policies, this idea of underlying health conditions of individuals rather than the sickening conditions of our society are a ready and predictable alibi for the powers that be. It's what some of my colleagues have rightly termed structural gaslighting. For more on this concept, I encourage everyone to check out this Scientific American article. The point is that the medical establishment has not simply been a bystander, but has aided and abetted explicit and implicit forms of racism, in part by creating scientific sounding alibis for those who perpetuate more obvious harms. The same gaslighting was evident in Dr. Eli Kleinman's report of Eric Garner's murder by Officer Pantaleo in New York City, in which he claimed that Garner's poor health and not Pantaleo's chokehold was to blame. Peak gaslighting. Indeed, I want to propose that there are at least two medical traditions, the one enabling and the other opposing racist violence. The first, exemplified by Kleinman's testimony, entails the historic and ongoing collusion of scientists and doctors with the powers that be, performing sterilizations in US prisons and detention centers, enabling torture at Guantanamo, not to mention the everyday neglect and mistreatment of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, disabled, femme, poor, trans, imprisoned, veteran, homeless, undocumented, and other vulnerable patients. This tradition, let's call it medicine as objective oppressor, was also responsible for building the intellectual foundations of scientific racism and mobilizing foot soldiers for eugenics policies around the country and the world. But importantly, this is not the only tradition. There's also a tradition of medical practitioners as not only healers, but truth tellers, whistleblowers, conscientious objectors, witnesses, community partners, and more. Those like Dr. Hannah Atisha, one of the whistleblowers in Flint, Michigan, who used their power and status and authority to challenge the powers that be, and who shine a light on medical abuse and neglect in their own backyards. We might call this tradition medicine as a moral force. And while there are many individuals who carry this tradition forward, organizations like White Coats for Black Lives exemplify a collective approach to transforming medical institutions and pedagogy. This is an organization of medical students that, in their words, was born in response to apathy. While people were mourning the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and were enraged by the non-indictments of the officers who killed them, the medical institution, which has historically had racism built into its foundation, largely remained silent. So in December 2014, medical students of color and allies across the country participated in die-ins to honor these individuals and demonstrate a commitment to dismantling the systems that led to their deaths. The actions of these students raised an important question to the institution of medicine. Are medical professionals responsible for combating racism? For these students who found themselves committed to a profession that has vowed to support the well-being of all patients and has consistently broken that promise, the answer was an emphatic yes. Their work and others compel us to widen our lens to an ailing body politic. And in my view, every profession needs a similar reckoning. Not only must we diagnose the deadly nature of everyday racism, but to really understand why it persists. To do that, we have to look beneath the surface at how inequities are encoded in everyday practices and protocols. And really, the best people to do that are those inside of a given profession or discipline or organization or institution. And so here I want to offer the bench as a metaphor for us to think about what this deeper vision looks like. So here you see a very simple park bench, and it's located in Berkeley, California, which is where I went to graduate school. And when I took this photo, I was working at BU at the time, visiting Berkeley in February. So I wanted to lay in the sun for a few minutes between meetings, and I realized quickly that I couldn't lay down on the bench comfortably because of the way it was designed. And of course, there are all kinds of reasons why we might have those armrests there. Functionally, just to put elbows on, if you're elderly, or when I was 9 months pregnant, getting up and down, they can come in handy. If there's a stranger sitting on one end, you might be more likely to sit down on the other end with that invisible air wall. But my mind went to probably what many of you thinking, that the armrests also deter people from sleeping on the benches. And that, in fact, when I did a little digging, I found that this is a global phenomenon, what architects call hostile architecture, designing public space in order to push unwanted people out, in this case, people who are homeless. And so I found single occupancy benches in Helsinki, only one booty at a time, no laying down there. I found caged benches in France. In this case, the mayor of the town put them out installed these on a Christmas Eve, and people in the town were so appalled that within 24 hours, they had them removed. And so it reminds us that we don't simply have to submit to what I'm calling discriminatory designs, but we can work together collectively and ensure that our public space, like our public policies, reflect our values. And then there's my favorite example of this genre, which is the spiked bench. In this case, you have to pay for the spikes to retreat for a set amount of time. I believe it buys you 15 minutes or so. And you'll be happy to know that this was originally created by a German artist to get us to think critically about questions of design, the metering of public life more broadly, whether it's the metering of education, the metering of healthcare, that although something can be nominally public for everyone, because of the way it's designed, it can have these forms of harm and neglect built into their design. And so we can take the bench as a metaphor and ask ourselves, what are the spikes that we're building into our own work? Or perhaps more accurately, what are the spikes that we've inherited? Because many of us start new positions doing work that, we weren't part of setting things up initially. For many of us, but we get a new role and we're handed the spiked bench, and we begin to notice these are the forms of harm and neglect built into it. So then the question becomes, what is our responsibility at that point where we begin to see and discern the way that discriminatory design is functioning in our institutions, in our classrooms, in our communities? And so when we think about it in light of the role of technology and the kinds of encoded inequities that, especially when we think about the way that technology is being posited as a fix in healthcare to bypass these forms of bias and inequality, I want to suggest that In fact, computational depth, when we talk about deep learning in AI, computational depth without sociological and historical depth should better be understood as superficial learning. That is, when we only understand things on the surface in terms of data without understanding context, then we're very likely to reproduce the kinds of harms that I'm describing. And even more dangerously, they will be shrouded with a veneer of objectivity. This is what I've termed the new Jim Code, riffing off of Michelle Alexander's term, the new Jim Crow, which is a way of talking about the combination of coded bias and imagined objectivity when it comes to tech fixes to inequality. And this is particularly relevant in healthcare, where we're being sold all kinds of tech fixes for these long-standing biases. And so to give you an example, in my grandma's time, she might have walked up to the front of the hospital and seen a big whites only sign. Now I can walk through the front door of a clinic or a hospital, but there may very well be a healthcare algorithm making decisions about my care that allocates resources in a way that has the same effect, same discriminatory effect. And even more dangerously, I won't even know about it. I won't see the individual sort of doing the designing. Instead, there'll be someone plugging away and being given instructions on how to treat me. And we'll both think that this is some kind of objective, neutral effect, result. And so what do we do about it? Now I'm going to start moving towards conclusion in the time left. Of course, there are macro top-down policy changes that have to happen, because the kinds of algorithmic discrimination that I'm describing in healthcare has infected all of our institutions. And so as a result, we have things like the algorithmic accountability bill being presented. And in the last couple of weeks, Dr. Alondra Nelson is one of the people who've spearheaded this blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. That's an important starting point for us to think about at a federal level, what the protections need to be around these forms of tech-mediated harm. And likewise, when the race correction example, I said that there's movement happening in terms of abolishing these kinds of algorithmic discrimination when it comes to thinking about race-based care, whether in terms of kidney function or in terms of cognitive function. And so these are important developments at the policy and institutional level. But what I'm calling viral justice wants to add another layer to this this shift, and I'm trying to orient us towards small scale, often localized action. I'm inviting us to witness how an idea or action that sprouts in one place can be adopted, adapted, or diffused elsewhere. So what does this look like? What does viral justice look like in the context of healthcare, public bioethics, and medicine? I think it looks like everyday people just doing their jobs to either maintain or disrupt the racist status quo. It looks like, for example, nurses demanding better of our healthcare system, where they're not only demonstrating on the streets, but demonstrating through their quality of care. We're treating all patients with dignity and respect, calling out forms of abuse and racism among their colleagues, mobilizing as a moral force against our deeply corrupt system. This is what I think of as viral justice at work, because they're calling attention to the pre-existing social conditions of our nation, not simply the pre-existing health conditions of individuals. I think it looks like how and what we teach, because as Professor Ann Fauster Sterling writes, the curricular problems run deep. Physicians are often taught, outright or through modeled behavior, to use racial generalizations and assumptions as shortcuts, resulting at worst in misdiagnosis and at best lost time reaching the right conclusion and treatment. And this is a really important article for those who haven't read it yet, that I encourage you to unpack and to think about how our pedagogy and our syllabi have to change. I think viral justice looks like changes to the way we ask questions, where we go looking for answers, who we listen to. For example, you remember I talked about the bias and pain treatment. In this case, a group of researchers understood that literature. And so instead of relying on doctors' reports of pain, they say they didn't train the algorithm to predict what the doctor was going to say. Rather, they trained it to predict what the patient was going to say about their own experience of pain in the knee. And so this is a reframing, a shift, and a deeper understanding of the sociology of knowledge and how they can build this other expertise into their framework. Viral justice, I think about is what happens when we uproot and when we decide what we don't want and what we do want more of. So in my mind, what we have to uproot is biological determinism, this way of thinking about immutable racial, racist differences across groups, but also perhaps slightly more subtly, it's about refuting cultural determinism, because even though many people might not rely on these genetic, this flattening of difference through genetics, and through biology, we often rely on cultural stereotypes to flatten social reality. And this sometimes happens even in the course of cultural competency training, where we associate different kinds of qualities and values with different groups that are quite stereotypical. And so we need to think about how we're deploying culture as another weapon that erases the context in which disparities are being produced. Finally, we have to resist technological determinism, which is, again, in this line of thinking, it's the idea that technology affects us, but how society is shaping the technologies, what values, ideologies, desires, worldviews are being encoded in our tools is often left out of the frame. And so these are three different forms of determinism that too often are often interlocking, but also shape our thinking, our language, and often our questions that we ask in our research and in our treatment. So if not these, what do we want to seed? What do we want more of? I want to suggest that at least two things that we should try to, two capacities and approaches we should try to grow are structural competency and cultural humility. And so structural competency is a framework, I believe, developed by Jonathan Metzl and Helena Hansen that is, again, getting us to widen our view and think about how the differences and disparities we observe are being produced. And again, it's using that language of competency, which we're often familiar with in the context of cultural competency, but it's saying, no, let's not focus on the inner qualities of groups, but on the outer processes that are shaping communities and individuals. And I think what goes along with that when we're thinking about culture is not looking out at culture, but looking in at our own culture. That is the values, assumptions, ideas that we're bringing to our research, to our encounters in clinics and in communities, and to really reflect critically on that and excavate that in order to understand how anti-Blackness and other forms of oppression are distorting our vision in the process. And this is a framework, I believe, developed by Dr. Melanie Tervalon out of Oakland. And so I would encourage people to look these ideas up and think about how they can shape our practice, our pedagogy, and of course, our policies. So again, viral justice, as I close, is about what happens when there's no spotlight, there's no audience. It's what happens behind closed doors and in the small print. It's a lens that encourages us to amplify like a microscope would, seemingly small efforts, and entice us to spread them. Because in the midst of multiple ongoing calamities, this work of crafting more caring social relations isn't charity work to be done on behalf of others. Falling from a burning building, I might hit the ground first, but you won't be far behind. My well-being is intimately bound up with yours. So we don't need allies. We need everyone to smell the smoke. We all have the ability to weave new patterns of thinking and doing, institutionally, interpersonally, internally. And these patterns must of necessity take many different forms, drawing on our varied skills, interests, and dispositions. So in my last 30 seconds, I want to give you some homework, drawing on that bench metaphor again, and ask you to think about, answer for yourself, answer in conversation with others. What are the forms of coded inequity, that is the spikes in your own work? And once you begin to think about that carefully, I want you to imagine new patterns of thought and action in the fine print. So rather than stay at the level of diagnosis, what do we change? How do we change that? And in the process of thinking about that and enacting just alternatives, let's collaborate, let's work with those most impacted by harmful systems, rather than reproducing a charity model of change. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and turn things back over to Professor Soo-Jin Lee. Thank you so much for your attention, everyone.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that very rich presentation, Ruha. There's a lot to talk about, and I actually want to move directly to your new book, Viral Justice, which I so appreciated and loved. But before I do that, I want to remind the audience to please submit your questions in the QA box. We'll get to as many as we can, but that's really your opportunity. And I know there are a few questions in the chat. If you don't mind migrating those over to the QA box, that would be fantastic. Some of you had your hands raised. Unfortunately, we can't call on you in this format, but we would welcome your questions. So your book, I devoured it. It's an amazing book. And in it, in the chapter, I want to go to the chapter that's entitled Hunted. And if I could just quote some of that, you say, public health, like public safety, has long been used to justify rounding up and isolating unwanted populations from the larger body politic. And you note that COVID-19, the pandemic, exposed yet again how the field of public health offers a smokescreen for policing racialized populations or people. And that in 2020, the American Public Health Association called out public violence, police violence, as the public health crisis that needs our attention. But in the end, you write, it doesn't matter how much truth you tell if the economic underpinnings of biomedicine remain tied to a market logic in which profit overrides the well-being of people and organized abandonment is the cost of doing business. You go on to underscore that a commitment to social and racial justice means calling on the abolition of the prison industrial complex as part of a strategy to reduce the possibility of future epidemics. This is very powerful. I want to give you space to help us understand the connection between policing, racialization, public health, and the market.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it's always so strange to hear our words read back to us, but I appreciate you taking time to draw out those quotes. I think again, to think concretely about examples of how these larger terms or systems overlap and are reinforcing each other in harmful ways. I think back to the first few weeks or months of the pandemic and examples of public health measures predictably resulting in the policing of racialized groups in the US and elsewhere. And so, again, going to Miami, there was a doctor who was giving out, COVID PPE to people who were homeless, and police showing up to his door and asking for ID and then arresting him. And, there's examples in New York where the percentage of people who are arrested for not following COVID protocols from Black communities was much higher than others, like pictures side by side of like white people in parks, not observing anything, being left alone, and then people being arrested. In the UK, the first person arrested under the COVID Coronavirus Act was a Black woman, Marie Deneux. Then we had those French doctors who went on live TV and was talking about, the way that we get our vaccines done is to go and experiment in Africa. And so it was like the way that medicine and public health, these so-called do-gooding professions, are so entangled with the punishment system. And so to think about how who benefits from that. And so part of what the take home is for us to understand that racism and other forms of inequality are productive. And when I say that, I'm not saying that they're good, but I'm thinking about we have to understand what they produce. They have produced certain disciplinary approaches and ways of thinking. They produce value in the punishment industry, billions of dollars of holding people even pre-trial. The billions of dollars that produces. Think about the racism produced in other areas. And so I think part of reframing racism from simply a negative, like the harm that it does, to what it produces, then it gets us to start thinking about who's benefiting from the continuation and the production of this form of inequality. Who benefits institutionally? You know, one of the chapters in the book is talking about these really notorious forms of medical experimentation, and how often the institutional actors who perpetuated that are written out of history. Like we don't call them by name. So we talk about the Tuskegee project rather than the U.S. Public Health Service in Tuskegee. And so the role of public health in perpetuating that harm is written out of how we invoke it. Instead, we talk about the racialized place and people as if they conducted the experiments on themselves, similarly with other egregious episodes. And so I think part of what I'm inviting us to do in this reckoning is to, one, think about how racism is productive, both economically, but also in terms of status, in terms of knowledge that's produced, like the experiments produce knowledge, you know, whether it's lead experiments or other public health experiments. And so we have to reframe it, because if we don't, then our gaze is always looking at the harm, if it's looking at the harm, but then we lose sight of who's benefiting. And I don't think we can really honestly address it, whether institutionally or in our teaching or in our practice, if we don't really come to grips with that.
Thank you. You know, I want to piggyback off of some of the things that you just said, particularly some of the ethics violation, the kind of notorious cases that are cited over and over again. And you write, you know, I'm going to go towards the end of the book where you write on the topic of trust. So this is one of your chapters. And you know, trust is one of those ubiquitous words that have been floating of late in terms of a goal that we should be striving towards. But you know, you write, you know, trust in science is the wrong goal, and that you write beautifully that chasing the mirage, let us turn our gaze underfoot. To recover centuries-long plague, we must magnify its source, study its contours, and listen to its victims. You say we should focus on trustworthiness that requires confronting power dynamics that privilege some forms of knowledge over others. And then you go on to tell the story, to illustrate this, the Kennedy Krieger Institute's lead abatement studies at Johns Hopkins. And you connect it to the lawsuit that ensued afterwards. And one of the plaintiffs, Freddie Gray, and his story. And I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about that case. And maybe, you know, I probably needs a little bit more scaffolding than I gave it for our audience. But I think this is an interesting illustration of some of the main points that you're bringing out in that chapter on trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the book, I'm telling a lot of stories as a way to think about these more conceptual, abstract processes, because I think through a story, we get to see the entanglement. We get to see how it's not so neatly divided. Like we have the policing issues over here, then we have the public health issues over here, then we have the education issues, that they're all deeply entangled and reinforce one another, which on the one hand feels very weighty, but to me that also means that no matter where we start, no matter what our plot is, where we're going to start our work, it's important because it then connects with other things. So whether you're working in education or public health or for abolition. So Freddie Gray's story, you know, starts with living in housing in which he was poisoned, you know, and so he experienced lead poisoning that affected his health. And he was put in remedial classes in school. And there's a pipeline between, you know, kids who are disabled and policing, because he missed a lot of school. He was not doing well in school. He was disciplined a lot because of his health. And so that led to a lot of early arrests before we even knew what, you know, his name because of his high profile killing in the back of a police vehicle, in which they did what they call a rough ride, which is don't seatbelt them, put them in the back and just drive really, really rough. And essentially his spine breaking in the process. And so we see how from public health, this lead experience, where it's so common in Baltimore that people receive lead checks because of, as a way to address this harm. And then it affects educational inequalities, and then it connects to policing, and then ultimately this high profile death. And what I'm inviting us to do is to look beneath the headlines and the murder or the killing, and see what are all of the domino effects that have contributed to this most egregious harm. And there are other examples like that in the book. And so it's this interinstitutional complicity in this case. And so then the question is, what does interinstitutional accompaniment look like in terms of redressing this harm, resisting this, trying to create something different? The other thing I'll just say, going back to the bioethics, is that, I started out in grad school studying stem cell, the social dimensions of stem cell research. And one of the experiences that I had that I recount in the book as a grad student was working, doing field work in a place that was developing stem cell treatments for sickle cell disease, and being kind of recruited in the process to be an ambassador for this treatment, because I assume the idea was to have a Black person as the face of it would seem more appealing to people who they were trying to recruit for this experimental treatment, kind of like the Black face of science, as a way to address the gap between research and community. And so I described what it felt like to be put in that position, especially as a grad student, where I didn't feel I had a real strong ability to say no, because that would limit access to this field site that I had already been invested in. And so again, I think this is where my thinking about trust came from, because the overwhelming focus is on, if we recognize people, aren't wanting to sign up for these trials, et cetera, the framing is around distrust, Black distrust, Latinx distrust, Indigenous distrust, rather than turning the lens back, again, the cultural humility, and thinking about how are we contributing to that? What forms of trustworthiness do we have to actually invest in and develop over time? And in the book, I give some examples of what that might look like, probably inadequate for the scope of the problem, but it's a starting point in some ways for us to think about. The last thing I'll say is, for all of us sort of thinking about this, to think about how entangled healthcare is with policing, the way that police are brought into our institutions, when we have non-compliant patients, or in terms of the family regulation system, when child welfare is called in, all of these forms of complicity, again, that show us that these aren't separate spaces, but we're really deeply complicit in maintaining this punishment industry and this punishment process when we bring these people into to solve or to fix different challenges in healthcare.
Thank you. Well, the questions are really coming in, so I'm going to move to our audience questions. And at the top of the list that's been upvoted is something that I think is on many of our minds in terms of the Supreme Court case around affirmative action. And Ami Zota asked the question, on the eve of a Supreme Court verdict that will likely strike down affirmative action, how do we as scholars and professors in the academy best practice viral justice?
Thank you for that question.
It's a tough one.
It's tough, but it's super important. I mean, it's something that in my mind, the answer doesn't change dramatically with the Supreme Court verdict. Like, it's the same things that we should be doing before and after are relevant in terms of thinking about, going back to some of the examples, what and how we teach, the kind of spaces that we create, environments we create on our campuses and our communities. It matters who we're allowed to admit under these policies and with what justifications. But part of what I'm arguing is that no matter the background of students or professors, the same standards apply in terms of anti-racist pedagogy, teaching, et cetera. And so, I'm just inviting us to not be disillusioned by the impending verdict, but to let that reinforce the things that we were already committed to, and to also collaborate with organizations and initiatives that were already doing the work around anti-racist education and pedagogy, rather than trying to invent something new or to have some new solution to this, because there are already so many people in the trenches, many of whom I highlight in the book. So if for those who care, really linking arms and working on these issues with community orgs and movements that have been doing this work before and after these policy changes. So thanks for that question.
Great. So another question is, what does viral justice mean in a world overburdened with, and he or she puts in quotes, spectacle, are viral stunts and protests of diminishing returns? How do you cut through the noise?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's funny because many people do associate the viral and viral justice with like digital virality, like things going viral, but it's really it's more of a reference to the virus itself. So it's actually getting us to turn away from spectacle and look at the microscopic, look at things that often are overlooked. And so in some ways it's I won't say an antidote, but it's a reaction to exactly this way in which spectacle stands in for more substantive change that is often in the fine print. It's the everyday protocols and practices that often are hidden from view. And so in my mind, it is a reaction, and it's an acknowledgement of the limitations of more performative, spectacular forms of change and lip service and platitudes and that sort of thing. So hopefully it'll become clear as you're reading that that's the kind of virality that I'm interested in.
Great. Rishi Sridharan asked the question, what is the role of students versus faculty in positions of more power in dismantling the spike benches in our system? In what ways can students and faculty collaborate to amplify each other's voices? And you talk a little bit about this in the book in terms of the choreography of solidarity. If you could speak to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a whole section in the chapter on work that is looking at within academia, the forms of hierarchy, inequality, exploitation, connecting that to what we see like in tech. So it's like academia to Amazon. And first, I think it's acknowledging exactly how the question is framed, Rishi, which is understanding the power dynamics within our institutions in terms of more and less power. But then, as the examples I mentioned indicate, it's also about students kind of owning their power and, understanding that oftentimes there's kind of inertia among faculty, whether it's because of the workload and because of, just maintaining business as usual, the kinds of transformative change that we might like to see isn't often coming from the top. So the kind of everyday troublemaking that students can do to raise awareness. I love one of the things that White Coats for Black Lives does that I didn't mention is that they issue report cards on medical schools. So every year they have a whole host of things that they measure, everything from courses and faculty to community practices, et cetera. And then they grade medical schools based on how they're doing in terms of anti-racism across a whole host of variables. And so it can serve many different functions. It can shame schools that are just like not acting. It can be useful to students who are thinking about where to apply, knowing the kind of academic culture and commitments that are characteristic of different institutions. But this is an interesting way of, although students may be lower on the hierarchy within our institutions. It's a way of wielding a certain kind of bottom-up power that I think can be useful. But then the other thing that I will just mention here that I talk about in this section of the book is it's this line from Diane Ravitch, which was a former assistant US Secretary of Education. At least this quote is attributed to her, where she says, teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions. And so this is, again, thinking about how our different positionalities are intertwined. So if students are, fed up with X, Y, and Z about their experience of education, thinking about how it's tied to how often adjunct faculty and graduate students are being treated, or rather mistreated, in our institutions is crucial to think about. The fact that 75% of the teaching workforce in the US, 75% is contingent labor, which makes it much harder when you're in that precarious position to stand up for things and make trouble in the institution. It actually supports maintaining these same regimes and same kind of protocols and practices. Maintaining the spikes is reinforced when educators don't have security. And so this is connected to, the kind of unionization and tenure for the common good, which is a wonderful organization, is directly tied to the kind of changes we can make in these institutions, because people aren't going to raise their voices if they feel like many people don't feel able to speak up if their jobs are on the line. And so again, thinking about our shared struggle, and I give examples of students, disappointed that like their classes aren't being offered because their teachers are on strike, but supporting the strike because they understand that their teachers' experiences are directly tied to their own education. So hopefully those of you who are interested in this question will find something of value in this part of the discussion in the book.
That's wonderful. Ruha, I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned about report cards for anti-racism that might be given to medical school programs. And I'm just wondering, if we were to put the dimensions that should be assessed, do you have some ideas about how we might assess, like what would be on that report card in terms of the dimensions? Yeah,
we don't have to guess. The report card we can download. Someone can find it right now. Someone can look up White Coats for Black Lives report cards, and we can see there's like 30 to 40 questions and dimensions that cover so much ground. There's sub questions. So we can put the report cards, we can see the questions, and we can see the grades that have been issued on Columbia, on Yale, on UCLA, et cetera, to see how. And I think what's important in answering your question is that the categories, the medical students came up with the report card, the dimensions, right? So it's thinking about what is important to their experience of education when it comes to anti-racism, and them generating the questions. And that's also what I'm suggesting for any of the things that we're discussing, that we really need to go to those who are most affected by whatever form of harm or dysfunction exists. And they need to be part of framing and thinking ahead about what needs to change. And in this case, we have a really tangible example that we can look to.
Great. Another question from an audience member: what is the balance between contributing to racialization of medicine and using racial data to support people? Yeah. Public health often pushes racial reporting to combat racism when it's quite unclear how this data will be used.
Very, very important. Yes. And so I think it's the distinction between thinking about what are the origins of the racial data? Like when we think about how the particular outcome or disparity is being framed, is it being framed as something intrinsic that's immutable, unchanging about certain groups, whether culturally or biologically, or is there an understanding of how that racial data was produced? And so my critique of the role of race in healthcare is not an invitation for us to try to develop some kind of colorblind approach or ignoring race altogether, but it's really a race conscious approach that understands the sociology and history of these racial categories. And so the Boston Review piece by Ann Fauster Sterling, if you read that, one of the stories in there is about a medical student who was sitting in a class when race data was being produced, and how, for example, the examples of STDs and syphilis, for example, a black hand or black skin black body was depicted as, for that particular ailment, and other less stigmatized ailments, white hands or white bodies were being used. And so the way that race and stigma were being reified in her classes, she started taking photos of the slides of the professors as a way to illustrate how they were being socialized to see through these distorted lenses that framed some groups through the stigmatizing lens and others through a more neutral lens. And so the opposite of that is not ignoring that there are health disparities across race, but it's acknowledging the way that stigma and racism play a role in creating whatever the outcomes are. And so it might take more time to explain, whatever, statistics or data that we're talking about, but we have to contextualize the statistics in the wider structures, but also historically to think about the origins of these differences. And so it requires, I think, a more interdisciplinary approach rather than a sort of simple quantitative or data science approach to this.
Okay. Lisa Kearns writes, there seems to be a deep, centuries-long fear of others, in quotes, by whites. How can that be assuaged in order to achieve the things you discussed? In other words, yes, racism is ingrained, but for some, it seems so deep-seated that changing attitudes feels futile at times.
Mm-hmm.
How do we not give in, I think, to resignation? I think that's what...
Yeah. Thanks for that, Lisa. That is one of the $1 million questions. And I would just add, part of it is to understand it at that emotional level, the level of fear, but also in the way that many sociologists frame it is as an investment in whiteness. So as one scholar puts it, a possessive investment in whiteness. And so while fear may be the external sort of what we see, we also have to think about how people are benefiting from that othering or that those distinctions across groups. What do you gain by associating pathology and negativity and danger with an outgroup? And so I think partly when we begin to see that in unjust, unequal systems, one's predicated on scarcity and inequality, then you need an ideological justification to maintain that monopoly on resources, that monopoly on power. And so one of the examples that I like to offer in conversations about this is that when we look at data across US states where there's more equality, more socioeconomic, the gap between the haves and have-nots is closer. The haves in those places are faring better than the haves in places that are more unequal. And so we look country by country, similarly, more egalitarian societies, those who are on the, nominally on top, they're doing better than in places where there's more inequality. And so part of what I think can start to push back at this investment in whiteness is to show that you have a self-interest in working towards equality. You have, you directly benefit both in terms of health, like the health of white people is suffering. One of the studies that just came out, some of you may have seen, I think it was Washington Post, that looked at now white people are dying of COVID at a higher rate than Black people. So the initial turn from that we've seen from most of the pandemic. And part of that can be explained by what Jonathan Metzl calls dying of whiteness. That is this investment in policies and in practices that maintain one's sense of status and power is actually deadly. And so an invitation to address this question is to say, don't do it for other people, do it for yourself. Do it because you will benefit by living in a society that's more egalitarian, both at the level of health and in the level of social connection and the social fabric. And so again, it's not going to change people's minds who are stubbornly invested in whiteness. But I think part of the reframing is to say that we need a solidarity framework for social change, rather than one in which you're doing something for someone else. You have to benefit by the kinds of egalitarian visions that we're suggesting.
Great, thanks. Caitlin McMahon has a question. First, she thanks you for providing such a powerful framework for understanding the productive aspect of racism and inequality. Expanding out from there, she says, I'm thinking about the increasingly ubiquitous framing of the health consumer and the supposed power that is invested in the personal consumer dollar. How can we think about, act on different types of rights, civil, social, political, without ceding the framing of the conversation around the marketplace and all of the historic inequities that inhere there?
Yeah, that's a really, I think, at the heart of a lot of what I'm thinking. I think my colleague Imani Perry in her book talked about like transactional citizenship, like you get things, you give things, like it's this that homo economicus model of, our society. And so how, part of the first question you started with, Sandra, in terms of the economic underpinnings of healthcare and policing, is to really to get us to think beyond the economic sort of production of these harmful systems. That means how else can we think about organizing social life if not in this transactional way? You give what you get, the spiked bench, right? And so I don't have another answer to this on top of what I've already shared in terms of what this reframing can look like away from charity to solidarity. But see here, I mean, in my own, the last thing I'll say is in my own context, in terms of education, because you talk about health consumer, and I'm thinking about educational consumer, students as consumers of education. Part of the function of that is that when students are socialized and educated to see social problems, the next step is often to think of themselves as, what product can I create to fix this or to address this? The kind of entrepreneurial model of change. And what I'm trying to encourage both my students and others who are newly awakened to these social crises is not to think of yourself as the solution or what you can produce, but to look around you and see who has already been working on this problem and this issue that I can link up with, that I can collaborate with, that I can be of service to. And so again, it reorients us away from the individual savior to thinking about what these collective processes can look like that are already underway that we can then join in. And so again, it's not a direct response to that, but it's a shared concern for the way that consumption becomes a proxy for other forms of engagement and collaboration and change.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the idea of this transactional relationship, perhaps, if we thought about it in terms of research, there is this one question from an audience member who says, how do we address those who argue we would not have scientific and medical advancements we have today without disturbing historical practices that led to innovations? And here I'm thinking about Henrietta Lacks, but there's countless examples. I want to give you an opportunity to weigh in on this question.
Yeah, can you just point me to?
It's right below Ami's at the top.
Okay. How do we address those who argue we would not have scientific and medical advancements we have today without disturbing historical.
Yeah.
I mean, my first reaction is, how do we know? Because we don't have a parallel universe in which we haven't carried out these horrific practices to see what we might have dreamed up, what we might have produced. And so part of it is a kind of speculative exercise where we think about, oh, the idea that the fruits of these harms, like it was inevitable, we had to have these harms in order to have these innovations and proofs. Rather than my response would be, how do we know? We don't have an alternative. What if we had tried other things? Who knows what greater things we might have developed or learned or come to grips with. And most importantly, how the social fabric, the social infrastructure that has been so eroded by the forms of mistreatment and violations that came to be normalized, how so many of the tech fixes or innovations that are being produced today to ameliorate those, we might not have even needed them because we wouldn't have been so affected in the first place. And so again, I think it's a good thought experiment, but my response is to always say, we don't know what we haven't tried. And so perhaps if we think on another timeline, and that's why I often teach with science fiction and speculative fiction, for my students to imagine alternate histories and alternate futures that are often excised from our collective imagination. We're not even allowed to dream them and think about how else it could be if we had not perpetuated these forms of harm. And so that's my initial thinking on that.
Great. So Cheryl Coonies has just submitted a question. Aside from report cards, so we were talking about report cards previously, do you have a simple way to assess if one has succumbed to unintentional racism in research design? And here she cites a CAGE questionnaire for the researcher. As researchers, we make our best attempt, but may unintentionally assume things that are racist and need a checklist to alert us to possible problems, not necessarily solve them. Is such a thing possible? And she's not suggesting that it's a substitute for becoming, she says, educated, as you described in the talk. So any suggestions for Cheryl?
I would hazard to guess that there are tools available. I am sure that people have come up with rubrics, tools. I definitely know that there are certain kinds of measures for these sorts of things, but I think what I hear Cheryl asking is something more preventative, more proactive, that you can use almost like a guide as you're designing or creating or developing research to sort of check the process. And so I would hazard to guess that there are these available, and it might even be cited on the website for White Coats for Black Lives, pointing to more resources. But it's a fantastic question. So I would point you there, but also if someone could drop the link for structuralcompetency.org into the mix, I think that both gives you a framework, but also practical projects that have used that framework, put it into practice, research and other collaborations to see how people have used that way of approaching scientific and medical questions and actually rolled it out in practice. So I would encourage you also to visit that website and get some ideas, and they might also have a resources tab that might be useful. Thanks for that question, Cheryl.
Terrific. What I really loved about your book, many things, but you wove personal stories, and you really powerfully demonstrated that the personal is inextricable from the public. You write, viral justice is not limited to the public expression of solidarity. It also involves reckoning privately with how we create distinctions between those who have earned our respect and sympathy and those we feel justified to dismiss and deride because they have been out of the category of human. And so just for our Columbia audience of clinicians and clinical staff and researchers, where we're working in a large urban academic center among communities in Washington Heights, Inwood, East Central West Harlem, what are practices that can catalyze and nurture what you're advocating in terms of viral justice?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think, one of the worries I had in writing this book is that in inviting individuals to take stock and reckon with their own complicity, but also their own power and ways that they can contribute to anti-racist action, that we would start, that the reader would see the individual as the main actor or the main protagonist. And so to answer your question, I think really what you'll see is that I'm asking individuals to think about what kinds of collectives, communities that you should foster and to hold you accountable, to learn from. And so in the context of, that you described, it's both collectives and communities within the institution and outside of. And so whether that is other like-minded people who are striving to put these things into practice, whether it's a research group that's going to have a book club, whether it's a community, collaboration in which community partners are empowered to have real checks and balances, or what I call informed refusal when it comes to research. And so it's the thing to do is to really create the kind of social fabric and forms of collective accountability, places where you can learn, take off the teaching hat, take off the expert hat, because too often that stifles us in terms of all of the things we still have to learn and know that's not common sense about group differences, about inequality. And so there's a lot of examples and rabbit holes and places you can learn from the book, but also resources we've shared here. And it's really prioritizing that. So much of the work that we do incentivizes individual achievement and success and know-how. And what we really need more of is to be more humble and think about what kind of communities of care that we need to foster and develop and grow so that it can guard us from what we don't even know we don't know in terms of reflecting back at us the kind of insights and practices to move forward. And so that's very vague, but hopefully through reading the book and through some of the other resources, you can add some flesh to that and think about how you might invest in that going forward.
Great. All right. I think we are going to close the session. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and engagement today. Your book is tremendous. I encourage everyone to go out and read this book. Thank you. I just have a few thank yous to make in terms of our Ethics Grand Rounds Organizing Committee for their support in planning this year's series. Thank you to the Division of Ethics staff, that's Tiana Sipapur, Dunya Alami Nasif, David Lamb, Shauna Benston, and Rachel Yarmolinsky for their critical support of this event. Thank you, our wonderful audience, for your thoughtful questions. The recording of this event will soon be posted on the Columbia Division of Ethics website. We will also include the transcript of the chat where you will find all of the really valuable resources that Dr. Benjamin referenced. We hope to see you on March 1st for our next Columbia Ethics Grand Rounds of this series. We also invite you to register for 2 upcoming virtual events. Our next ELSI Friday Forum is entitled Genetics and AI, Group Privacy and Fairness. That will take place November 11th at 12 noon Eastern Time to 1 p.m. And also our next Bioethics in Film from Screen to Seminar event in which we will have a panel discussion of the documentary Intersection. That event will take place November 15th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. And again, both of these events are virtual. To receive information about these and other events, we invite you to subscribe to our Division of Ethics newsletter. The link should be in the chat. And then finally, but really importantly, you will receive a post-event survey. And I really encourage you to complete this as our organizing committee takes your comments and suggestions very seriously. In fact, past responses have informed us on how to improve our events and bring new topics and speakers to you. So please do fill it out. We really appreciate that so many of you joined us today. I wish you all a wonderful week, and please take good care. Thank you.